Welcome, Lord Fowler, to the National Archives. And here we are at our facsimile cabinet table. And you were Health Secretary from 1981 to 1987. And as such, as a member of the cabinet, you were privy to all the big discussions of the day. I think people may not quite realise, being in charge of an important department, such as the Department of Health and Social Security, what that means in terms of your daily working life. Could you talk me through what your sort of typical working day was like as Health Secretary? You know, was the job constantly highly pressurised?
Yes, it was, and for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, it was a double-headed department. It included Department of Health and the Department of Social Security. So we had not only all the health policy issues, but we had all the social security, pensions issues as well. So by any standards, it was a demanding department. We were responsible for about 1/3 of public spending. So, and at a time when the government were seeking to reduce the amount of public spending, this was not perhaps the most enviable position to be in. So yes, I would say I've never worked so hard in my life. I mean, it was a complete change. I'd been Transport Secretary before that, but nothing compared really with the Health and Social Security job, because no sooner had one problem finished at one end of the department, you got another one at the other end. I mean, it was that sort of thing. But having said that, it was also a time that you could make changes, and there were changes that needed to be made.
It does sound very demanding to me. And could you also explain to us your previous background and what it was that got you into politics in the first place?
I started life as a journalist. I was a journalist on the Times for almost 10 years, but politics has always been my ambition. And I was part of that group at Cambridge called the Cambridge Mafia, who included Ken Clarke and Leon Britton and Michael Howard and people like that. We were all there at roughly the same time. And I suppose we all had more or less the same sort of motivation. None of us were really from established public schools. There weren't too many Etonians in my lot. What we did want to do was to change things, and change things for the better. And I think that it just gave us the opportunity of doing that. I mean, I'm not sure that many of us thought at the time we're going to be cabinet ministers. I certainly didn't. I mean, that was a long way away. But the ambition was to become a member of Parliament. And it was, I think, in a sense, it's a pity that the status and prestige of members of Parliament doesn't appear, to me, to be quite the same as it was then. It was an ambition in its own right.
And of course, it's widely recognised that one of the biggest contributions that you've made to public life is in your work in countering the AIDS epidemic. This is the subject I'd like to focus on in our discussion. The hugely successful Channel 4 drama, It's a Sin, highlighted this issue last year. Of course, before perhaps moving on, it's very important, I think, when you're talking about this issue, to draw out the distinction between HIV and AIDS. Is that something you could do for us and just explain why those distinctions are important?
Well, basically, it was that HIV was the virus that was being transmitted. It was normally being transmitted. It could be by sexual intercourse, but of course it could be transmitted by injecting drugs as well, which people tend to forget about.
Yes.
So there were different ways it could be transmitted, but it was not until that became AIDS itself that you got into the real problems. And the difficulties in the 1980s was we had no vaccine, no medicine that could counter effectively HIV and AIDS. And so it left you with few choices about what you could do. If you wanted to do something, you had to persuade people, and that was the background of our campaign. It was on the basis that we couldn't just let it go and say, well, sorry, we can't, there are no medicines to deal with this. We could at least try to persuade those people who hadn't got the virus to take precautions, and as long as they took those precautions, they were reasonably secure. You know, we advised people to use a condom, for example. These were things that the government, I don't think, government ministers, at any rate, had not been very accustomed to doing. But that was the challenge as far as we were concerned. I had a great chief medical officer called Donald Atchison who helped me in all these things. And we managed to get a campaign on the roads. The only difficulty we had, of course, were if you already had HIV, you saw these campaigns which were against contracting HIV, and you had to be as sensitive as you could be to people who had already contracted it.
Sure.
But the biggest challenge was to actually prevent new people from contracting HIV and then going on to AIDS.
Sure, sure. Now, the files that we hold here at the National Archives, they show that the upper levels of the Thatcher government became sort of galvanised about the health threat posed by AIDS around the sort of autumn of 1985, and you as Health Secretary, you know, as you've said, as you've reminded us, you were the driving force really behind the health education campaign, and that really got underway publicly in sort of early 1986. Given that the first case of AIDS in the UK was in 1981, when you look back, do you wish that there'd been opportunities to perhaps act a bit sooner? How do you feel about that?
I'm not quite sure what we would have done. I mean, you see, I mean, acting, it was such a limitation on what one could actually do. As it happened, I think that the campaign that we launched came at about the right time, in that it also coincided with public concern. I mean, I forget exactly what the figures were, but I think in about 1985-86 we only had about 250 cases. But the trouble was that of those 250 cases, most were going on to have AIDS and most were going on to die. So concern went up. I don't think there was much concern about it in this country, at any rate, in the early 80s, and it hardly, it didn't register to the same extent. It did elsewhere, but as far as UK was concerned, it was a relatively slow growth in concern. But to run a campaign, you needed to have public concern on one side, right, and also the determination to do something about it on the other. I think had we run a campaign in 1981, I mean, I don't think anyone would have taken any notice. But I think, you know, by 1985, come 86, then people were beginning to notice and people were beginning to take the message. The most important step, well, one of the most important steps we took was to set up a special AIDS committee in 1986. And that brought half the cabinet onto the committee. Up to then, it had been all dealt with by the General Home Affairs Committee.
Right.
And that wasn't satisfactory because no one became expert on the subject. So I would bring papers there. The other members of the committee would not have done their homework. No, I'm not criticising that, but they wouldn't have done the homework because they weren't involved. That actually did change everything, with Willie Whitelaw in the chair, and he and I worked together. He was absolutely magnificent. And Donald Atchison was there as well. And then we also had great help from the secretary to the cabinet, Robert Armstrong, who was also important. The only person we didn't have a great deal of support from was, of course, the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. I mean, it's not that she came out opposed to what we were doing, but she was not an enthusiast, to put it that way. And so when we get on to the detail of the campaign, I mean, she obviously had her very strong reservations about it.
Yes, and that's certainly something I've picked up in the files, which show that you had several battles with Mrs. Thatcher, particularly over the language to be used in the newspaper advertisements, in the leaflet that went out to every household in the UK. Mrs. Thatcher, she seemed to take the view that she was concerned that if young teenagers were to read details about or references to anal sex or something like that, that this could be dangerous or put into their heads practices that they otherwise would never have heard of, and could we not place advertisements in lavatories like the old VD campaign during the Second World War? How do you view all these arguments now? I'd be interested.
Frankly, I think that I and my team were right and Margaret was wrong. I mean, she did take this, I think, rather extraordinary view that if we told people about these issues, and particularly young people about these issues, that somehow would have a deleterious effect. In fact, I think it was exactly what we should have been doing. What she seemed to believe is that once you told young people about it, that would encourage them to experiment. Well, there was no evidence of that then, and there's been no evidence since of that. I mean, people were warned, and you could see the kind of rates going down and the rest. She didn't really have her heart in this campaign. It wasn't, I think, one of her proudest moments. And I think this view that if you told people things that would encourage them, I think is way off the mark. So we did have problems with Margaret, but the point was we did have the Cabinet Committee with Willie Whitelaw. And the great advantage of that was Willie Whitelaw was the number two. As long as he and I agreed, and as long as the committee agreed, the Prime Minister wasn't going to intervene, mainly, to say, I don't agree with the committee. She did have a go at disagreeing with the committee. She said on one of the advertisements, do we really need all this stuff about risky sex? Well, as the whole thing was to warn against risky sex, the answer was, yes, we do need that stuff. I don't think she liked the language either. And of course, it's always, I'm afraid to say, if you look at her memoirs, I think I'm right in saying, I don't think AIDS is mentioned there at all. So I think it's fair to say that although she mostly went along with what we did, and at least didn't object, didn't torpedo it, she didn't really have her heart in the AIDS battle.
Of course, Norman, concerns about the AIDS health campaign didn't just come from Margaret Thatcher, did they? It came from other quarters as well, including some religious leaders.
Too right. We had more problems with the religious leaders than probably anybody else, I think, because they said this is not a public health campaign. This should be a moral campaign, and that you should teach people, the government that is, should teach people about chastity and the importance of it. Well, my view on that was, I mean, first of all, it seemed inappropriate, frankly, for government ministers to go out there and talk about chastity. But secondly, you only needed one of the things to go wrong, one of the ministers to go wrong, one of the MPs to go wrong, and the whole campaign got destroyed in any event. So I think it was we did it in a much more effective way. We kept on the public health lines, but it didn't stop. I'm using this paper now. This is an aid memoir from the then chief rabbi. So, very, very major figure. And what he said about the campaign was that the campaign breeds false sense of security, not to mention false values, tells people not what is right, but how to do wrong and get away with it, like sending people into a contaminated atmosphere, but providing them with gas masks. Well, that was a long way away from where we are. That was the aid memoir that he left me when he came to see me in, I think it was February the 9th, 1987. So he had considered it, and I'm sure there were others. I know there were others who actually, broadly speaking, took that view. No one quite as explicit as the chief rabbi on that, but we did face this hostility, and let's face it, we faced a lot of hostility on the grounds that these were gay people. And what the hell were we doing about, why should we be bothering about gay people? I mean, afraid. There was that view as well. And I remember when I went to the United States, looking to see what they were doing, which was less than we were doing actually. But I came back, and I don't think either Margaret Thatcher or Norman Tebbit, the chairman of the party, were at all pleased with the way that the tour had gone. Everyone else was delighted, but they thought that it was not a good idea that ministers, cabinet ministers, should be seen going around talking to some pretty ungainly people at times in the United States. But that was the reality of it. So yes, we did have battles, but I have to say this in defence of my cabinet colleagues, that once we had the cabinet committee, they then started to view the whole thing as something that they were involved in. And that perhaps is the big lesson of it. They became involved, there became a sort of team effort, if you like, on how we could prevent it. The objections that I was getting, they disappeared, basically, once the team got going. There were a whole range of supporters who became really very firm allies as far as this was concerned. So it was an important step as far as we were concerned. And it also did mean that although Margaret continued to have her reservations and her objections, she knew perfectly well that she'd got half the cabinet who were on this committee, and she couldn't really double guess them.
In your book on the AIDS crisis, you said that when the AIDS issue first landed on your desk, at that time, you didn't know very many gay people, but that was to change. You've sort of mentioned, the sort of rather fierce opposition at times to, just consulting with gay people. But do you feel now, looking back, that you and Sir Donald Aitchison, you were successful in bringing the gay community, self-help groups, etc., into the tent, to sort of get them on board with the health education campaign?
We tried to do that, and I think that most of the people who were working in that area there would have support, or I'm sure all of them would have supported what we were doing. Some of them might have said we should go further, but I think Donald made quite a lot of efforts to form links with the different voluntary organisations, and there were some very good ones. There was Terence Higgins Trust, for example, was a very good one, and we actually set up our own one, which was called the National AIDS Trust, which still is very much around today. And so we did try to involve everyone concerned as far as we could. But we're talking about the space of, I don't know, less than 12 months here, and it was difficult to get everything on the road at the same time.
Well, Norman, of course, attitudes have changed a great deal, since the early to mid-80s regarding the whole kind of position of gay people and bisexual people in society today.
Yeah.
It was a much harsher climate then, back in the 80s. I think it's true to say that the tabloid press, for example, were not always helpful, to say the least, in the way that they, referred to this talk of a gay plague and all this sort of thing. When you look back on that period, what are your thoughts on that aspect?
I think my thoughts on that are, you're right, and there were reservations, and there were bad headlines, and there were bad articles. But to be fair, once we started campaigning seriously with the television adverts and all that, then the press more or less got behind us as well. So it was a matter of leading, really. As long as the government led, then people began to understand what it was all about, and then it didn't become sort of all headlines about gay plague and the rest. I think there's an important point to be recognised here. Perfectly true that I knew little about the gay population until the 1980s, and that was the case for a whole range of people. But there was a basic issue which went beyond, views about gay sex and all that. It was a feeling that what was happening too often was it simply wasn't fair that gay people were being marginalised in the way that they were. It wasn't fair that some people were saying, well, you don't need to worry about them. I mean, they're outside society or whatever it happens to be. And there was my basic motivation at this point, the motivation of many politicians, that there was a situation which it just ain't fair what is happening, and we need to challenge it. And it, in a sense, had nothing to do with a view on gay people, although I obviously supported them. It was an issue of fairness.
Yes, sure. And I think you agree with me that the action of Princess Diana in visiting a hospice in 1987, I think at the West Middlesex Hospital, that act of meeting patients who had AIDS and holding their hands and empathising, that had a tremendous effect, didn't it?
It did have a tremendous effect. 2 months earlier in San Francisco, I'd done the same. It's quite an interesting experience because we didn't really know anything much about AIDS, how it was transmitted. And I have to admit that even after all the best evidence that it didn't actually, there was no risk to health, you did have this kind of worrying thought that I hope the chief medical officer knows what he's talking about in this. And I did it with a nice man who died shortly afterwards, who was a shipping clerk from memory, and we had a conversation there. But what I did was minimal compared with what Diana did, because there we had this beautiful young princess sitting down with people who had AIDS and talking with them and actually illustrating much more clearly that it wasn't something that was infectious in the way that a cold was infectious. I mean, she did tremendous work on this, and she did tremendous work elsewhere in the AIDS field. But that image of her talking with AIDS patients, I think, is one that everyone remembers, and I will always remember. So I'm very grateful to her. She couldn't have done more as far as AIDS sufferers were concerned, and as far as countering the whole prejudice that there was about AIDS and about people and about gay people.
Just about everyone of a certain age who lived through the 1980s will remember the famous Monolith television advert with the gravestone and the white lilies and John Hurt's voiceover. And there was also the advert, the icebergs advert as well. Now, these were tremendously powerful. Can you tell us a bit more about how those television adverts came to be commissioned and the importance of them?
Well, what was quite clear is that, to go back to the beginning, Margaret might have thought that notices in public lavatories would be sufficient, although I think she did move off that. Self-evidently, we were in a new age of communications, and we needed to use television. Television was by far the most powerful media that we had, and then you needed to decide on the campaigns. And we had a good campaign. A man called Sammy Harari did it. Well, we had one advantage in the advertising campaign. We already had a campaign going on trying to prevent people from taking drugs, a major campaign. Sammy Harari was very much involved in that campaign. And so we had learnt a number of things during that time. And it was those lessons that we could now put into practice as far as AIDS was concerned. And it was a matter of them, basically, putting up their ideas on what the advertisement should be. I would then go through it with Tony Newton, who was my number 2 now at the health department. And we would then show it to the committee, and off it would go. I don't think anything seriously got vetoed. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think one thing got vetoed. For some reason, in one of the advertisements, they had put one of these sirens on the trains in the Wild West. Those sirens which went on, and for the life of me, I couldn't understand the relevance of this. And I think the only relevance of it was that it woke people up. You know, they're having their cup of tea. We decided that that wasn't necessary, but it had nothing to do with, absolutely nothing to do with HIV/AIDS. And then we went on in the way that you have described. And they were very effective, they were very powerful. And I think we got relatively few complaints about them, actually.
Yes, sure. Yes. They're certainly very memorable.
I mean, it's one of the interesting things is that once you set things out and you do things, the public respond if they think that it is a good cause. And I've got a whole report here monitoring what the effect was. And it shows that the public was behind us in what we were doing, what we were trying to do. That is not to say that they agree with every detail of it, but what they did agree with was that the government were trying to take it by the scruff of the neck and trying to do something about it, and not just looking the other way. That would have been the temptation, and that did happen in a number of other countries.
So, 1986 to 1987, these were the sort of wartime emergency years for, in terms of the government response regarding AIDS. But thereafter, it seemed to fade as a public issue. Why do you think that was?
It's a very difficult question for me to answer. I try and answer it as frankly as I can. The Prime Minister wasn't keen on this campaign. I had a meeting with her on New Year's Eve, an extraordinary meeting. I went to number 10 Downing Street on New Year's Eve, and she gave me a glass of whiskey, said she wasn't going out, far too busy. And then we talked about these issues. And she said to me at one point, Norman, she said, you mustn't become known as just the Minister for AIDS. And I didn't get the impression that this was a compliment that she was giving to me. So I left the department in 1987. I had been there for 6 years, and which I think was certainly this double-headed department was a record. I don't know what she said to John Moore when he came in. I have no idea. I never asked him. But I suspect she said, Fowler has been going rather over the top on the AIDS issue. You don't need to do that. That's a rather sanitized way of the way that she would do it. I only say that because I do remember when I first took over in 1981, I went in and I hardly noticed it at the time, but only in retrospect. And she said to me, George Young, you know, he's been doing far too much, arguing against tobacco and smoking. If we're not careful, we won't have any sponsored sport left. George was transferred. He was a very good parliamentary secretary, but he was transferred to another department. So she did have make the analogy, she did have her strong views on this. I think it is inconceivable that she did not make that strong view known to the Secretary of State coming in, John Moore, and to everybody else. So yes, it lost force, the campaign, I fear, at that point. I think that was a major reason. I mean, if the Prime Minister is lukewarm on it, and obviously the Treasury, I should make a point about the Treasury. The Treasury never gave me any new money for my campaign. I had to actually take it from different budgets inside the department, but they didn't volunteer anything. And of course, they were perfectly happy not to actually provide money because it meant additional spending, which was totally against what they wanted. But I think that I think everyone was rather began to take their cue from Number 10. That's my view. It is a biased view, and perhaps there are those who would challenge it, but I would doubt if anyone could challenge that it was not an element in it. And as you know, I'd already had the ministerial broadcast, which had been okayed by the committee. We were going to have a ministerial broadcast on AIDS, but the Number 10 officialdom found out that it could only be done if the Prime Minister okayed it. And so it went to the Prime Minister. So in fact, in spite of the fact that it had been approved by the committee, the Prime Minister said no. She hadn't had a campaign, she hadn't had such a broadcast on the Falklands or anything else, and she was blowed if she was going to have one on this. So I'm afraid some of the spirit went out of the campaign, but it didn't matter too much because it was frankly too late for people to go back on what we'd already done.
Sure. I suppose you could argue that, you know, those powerful TV adverts and all the other messaging had a big impact. And perhaps, you know, there's a limit to how much you can keep the issue on the boil, you know, in the public consciousness.
I mean, I think there was truth in what you say in that. There's no question about that. Obviously, we couldn't go on forever doing what we had done. I just feel that somehow the spirit went out of it all, and that was a pity. But I do accept that you simply cannot keep a campaign of the kind of intensity that we had done going forever. You could actually, however, go on for other campaigns. And if you take the commercial analogy, I mean, if you're running a campaign for a company, whatever it's doing, I don't know, selling a particular product, you come to the end of one phase of it, and you would then go on to the next phase. I don't know what the next phase would be because it wasn't my job, but there would have been a next phase. There should have been a next phase, and there wasn't. And I think that was a pity, but it did limited damage. I don't think it didn't torpedo everything that had gone before, because what had gone before was so dramatic.
Well, you know, looking back at the whole issue, do you think there are particular lessons that can be drawn from the way that the British government handled the AIDS crisis?
I think the major lesson is that you trust the people. I mean, what happened as a result of this campaign was that there was an enormous increase. I've got the whole report here. Enormous increase in knowledge about HIV/AIDS. What this independent report says is that the public totally accepted that this was a sensible thing for the government to do. And I think as long as the government is open, straightforward, says what it believes, and as long as you can carry the public, obviously, in what you're doing, then I think that trusting the public is the thing that you should first do for a campaign, and then make it as straightforward as you possibly can do. I don't accept that the argument that we should have made some of the advertisements less forceful. But what's the point? It doesn't have any effect. We did do one, actually. We did an advertisement. It looked rather like one of those prescription forms that you get. And it had, I don't know how much we spent, but we spent it. And it had absolutely no effect at all. It was only when we got on to actually punching the message through that people started to notice, and then they did notice.
Congratulations, by the way, on being appointed UN Ambassador for AIDS. How do you see your key aims in that particular role?
The number one aim is really to spread knowledge in every conceivable way. Spread knowledge, obviously, inside countries, but to spread knowledge inside this country, inside the United Kingdom as well, on what the problems are overseas. I do remember being on the front bench in the House of Lords, and I'd asked a question about AIDS, and someone next to me, a very senior ex-minister, said, well, no one dies from AIDS anymore. Well, at that point, I think 35 million people had died from AIDS. And we do tend to, unless we're careful, think of this issue just in UK terms, but it has been such a worldwide problem, and still is a worldwide problem. There are all kinds of problems in all kinds of nations. The real matter is, where do you start? I mean, it is so enormous, this problem, which still continues. Hopefully medicine will have its part to play, and then we'll come into a question of, will we be able to finance the medicine? Well, at least, we're making progress.
And obviously events such as the annual World AIDS Day, that's always, a timely reminder every time, isn't it?
It is, except I sometimes have the feeling that we do everything on World AIDS Day, literally everything that you can think of, government statements and all that. And then there's a slight temptation, I think, for everyone to go to sleep till the next World AIDS Day comes around.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of keeping the momentum going.
Sure. Well, I'm sure you'll do that very ably. So looking back on your time in government, Lord Fowler, can you pinpoint, one thing that you are particularly proud of, and also, do you have any regrets?
Well, I'm proud. I mean, I am satisfied that we saved a lot of lives in the HIV/AIDS crisis. And I think that as far as ministers are concerned, that is the most important thing that you can do. I mean, I can go into all the other things that I claim I did in my period of government, but I won't. Have I any regrets? Well, when I was a journalist, I specialised in the Home Office. And needless to say, when I became a politician, I had two ambitions. One was to become Home Secretary, and the other was to become party chairman. Well, I became party chairman, and then the opportunity did come up, I think, for me to become Home Secretary as well. I think had I been Home Secretary for Margaret Thatcher, it wouldn't have worked. My hero as Home Secretary was Roy Jenkins.
Yes.
And I don't think that was exactly Margaret's view of Home Office politics. So I was very lucky. I mean, I did 3 government departments, had the opportunity of having an effect in all of them, actually. So I have absolutely no complaints.
From talking with you, I mean, it's clear that being Health Secretary, it was an incredibly demanding job. Did you actually enjoy it when you were doing it?
I'm not sure enjoying is exactly the right word. I was satisfied that we had done many of the things we should have done. And I think that's all you can actually expect from a government job. You can't say I've done everything that was required, because no one is able to do that. But I think that in an issue like HIV/AIDS, we did many of the things, and in other government departments, I hope we did many of the things that were required. But it's a continuous process, government, and other people come along with new ideas, and long may that be the case.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Lord Fowler, for sharing your experience with us and your views on the AIDS crisis and the ongoing situation with AIDS. We're very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.